Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Monday, November 13th, 2023. Our guest today is a longtime friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Tom DiLorenzo. Tom is a well-regarded economist, a highly regarded economic historian, an expert on Abraham Lincoln, and an expert on something we are going to discuss today, a dreadful, dreadful aspect of American society called American exceptionalism. Tom, my dear friend, congratulations on being named the president of the Mises Institute, an entity that you and I firmly both believe in, and welcome to Judging Freedom.
Thank you very much, Judge, and pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So what is the myth of American exceptionalism?
Well, in my article that you alluded to earlier before the show started, is after in 1960, Life magazine invited Robert Penn Warren, the great novelist, author of All the King's Men and many other great novels, to write a book on the legacy of the Civil War, and he did. It's called The Legacy of the Civil War, a great little book. And the main point that I got out of that book is he said that after the war, the U.S. government waged a years-long, decades-long propaganda campaign to portray, to claim that there was a treasury of virtue in the government because of what happened at the Civil War, and they used the Lincoln assassination especially to deify Abraham Lincoln and then eventually the entire government. And what Robert Penn Warren said is that what this led to was the idea that whatever the American government did anywhere on earth was virtuous by virtue of the fact that it's the American government doing it. He called it a plenary indulgence, more so than the saints, he said. And he gives chapter and verse on that. And that sort of morphed into the language of American exceptionalism. And this has been used to justify being the bully of the world for generations now, in terms of the U.S. government.
Is this the view?
The ending of the war.
Tom, is this the view that somehow Americans are better human beings, or that our government is more virtuous, or the land is better, or that somehow we have the right to tell everybody else how to live because we're better people? Is that what exceptionalism is? I know I sound a little bit like George W. Bush in 2001, but I'm trying to get the question out.
Yeah. Yes, it's what my old friend Clyde Wilson, the historian, calls the Yankee problem in America. He said even before the Civil War, he says that there goes back to the New England Puritans. And it wasn't all Northerners or Yankees. I'm from Pennsylvania, but I never consider myself a quote Yankee. But it's a particular type of person who believes that he or she has some sort of God-given ability to order everybody else around. And Clyde Wilson said, for example, in his writings, he said Hillary Clinton would be a museum-quality specimen of a Yankee. And that kind of attitude has always been there. And I think Americans after the Civil War, latched onto this idea that the saintliness of Lincoln and then of the government itself was also their saintliness, that their exceptionalism, and that they really, a lot of Americans really did believe that they were exceptional because they think their government is so exceptional. And this was the result of a decades-long propaganda campaign by the Republican Party, which monopolized federal politics for 60 years after the Civil War, after all.
So Lincoln favored slavery almost his entire life, promoted it in his first inaugural, didn't free a single slave with his Emancipation Proclamation. How did he become so deified?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, there's a book that I cite called The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln by Larry Tagg, T-A-G-G, historian. And he says during his lifetime, Lincoln's lifetime, he was arguably the most hated and reviled of all American presidents. And he bases this on just what the Northern press was saying about him, the Northern public, not the Southerners, the Northern public was saying about him. But the assassination, immediately, William Seward took the corpse away from Mrs. Lincoln and ordered that no one ever touch the face. He wanted it to look as gruesome as possible and took it on a 1,600-mile train trip so that Americans could observe what happened to Lincoln when he was assassinated. And the New England clergy, which had reviled Lincoln for years because he was a well-known atheist, all of a sudden began talking about him as though he was a saint. Harper's Magazine published a lithograph with an angel ascending to heaven above an open tomb, and the head of the angel was a lifelong atheist, Abraham Lincoln, his head. And some of the first biographies of Lincoln that were written said things like his mother was the most chaste woman in the world next to the Virgin Mary herself.
Oy.
His father was so illiterate he could never sign his own signature, but he somehow was able to read the Bible, and magically was able to read the Bible. And things like this went on, and the American public bought it.
Wasn't Lincoln a lifelong white supremacist who never believed in the equality of the races, either the biological equality, the moral equality, or the political equality?
Yes, he stated this many, many times in one of his Lincoln-Douglas debates. He said, "I, as much as any man, want the superior position to belong to the white race." And he denounced equality among the races in any way. He used the word in any way. And then, of course, in his first inaugural address, he endorsed a constitutional amendment that had passed the House and the Senate after the South seceded, by the way. So it was all Republican in the House and the Senate.
This is the famous Corwin Amendment.
The Corwin Amendment.
And what would that have done had it been ratified and made a part of the Constitution?
Well, that would have explicitly enshrined slavery, the protection of slavery, in the text of the Constitution. And so, another constitutional amendment, maybe two amendments, would have had to have been passed in the future to rescind all of that. And so that's why in some of my writings, I call Lincoln's first inaugural address his slavery forever speech, because he was willing to allow slavery to exist, for as long as it would exist, as long as the South would come back into the Union and continue paying federal taxes.
Didn't Lincoln's administration enforce the Fugitive Slave Act during his presidency?
Yes, they did. There are several scholarly books about that. And even in Lincoln's speeches, he very strongly supported the Fugitive Slave Act, which obligated Northerners basically to run down and capture runaway slaves and return them. They were paid, double if a local magistrate that decided to return a slave to his owner was paid double if he decided otherwise. If he decided the slave should remain free. And Lincoln, during his administration, enforced the Fugitive Slave Act, even in Washington, D.C.
Wow. Did Lincoln understand the economic costs of tariffs and who actually pays them?
Well, I think he did, but I think he was a lifelong protectionist. When he won the nomination, one of the ways in which he won the nomination was he sent an emissary, Judge David Davis, who he would later appoint to the Supreme Court, of famous the Dred Scott decision dissent, David Davis. And he sent him with all of his speeches on protectionism to convince the Pennsylvania iron makers like Thaddeus Stevens that he was their man. They would have protectionist tariffs if he was elected president. So yes, he was a lifelong protectionist, and he was not a stupid man. He was very smart, very clever. And it's hard for me to believe he didn't understand that this was just an instrument of plunder. But if you're on the money receiving side of plunder, it's not such a bad thing, is it?
Right.
If you're on the paying side, it's a bad thing.
Did Abraham Lincoln commit treason?
I think unequivocally he did. Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution uses the word only, that treason is only defined as levying war upon the United States or giving aid and comfort to their enemies. And the key word there is there because it's in the plural. And so all the founding documents referred to the phrase United States in the plural, meaning the individual states, as they're called in the Declaration of Independence, the free and independent states. And so by levying war upon the southern states, Lincoln committed the exact definition of treason, but he took it upon himself to just redefine treason as essentially criticizing him and his administration. And he's been praised for that. There's a legal scholar named George Fletcher who wrote a book called On Lincoln's Secret Constitution. And he basically says, and actually Alexander Hamilton had this idea in his time. Hamilton argued that if the government does something that is unconstitutional, the fact that it did it and got away with it makes it constitutional. Hamilton.
Yes.
And that doesn't really fly in Hamilton's
as
day.
repellent as that is to the modern ear, I am familiar with that argument. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who accept that argument today. Just about every American president,
Yes,
from FDR up to the present time, is of the view if the government got away with it, that makes it constitutional.
Yeah,
Wasn't Lincoln the first head of state to wage war on civilians? It wasn't army versus army. It was army versus civilians. I mean, look at what Sherman's army did to the people living in Georgia and South Carolina towards the end of the war.
Not just the end of the war, too. The entire duration of the war, it was waged war on civilians. The original war plan was called the Anaconda Plan. They wanted to surround the southern ports and have ironclad blockades, like a snake and the anaconda, and of course that would have harmed civilians, just like when we surrounded Iraq for 10 years and caused the death of 500,000 children in Iraq, and that was a different kind of anaconda plan. But there's also, of course, the massive bombing of Atlanta after the army, the Confederate Army, had evacuated. There was the bombing of Charleston, where there was no army there, no Confederate army, but several thousand artillery shells per day landed in the city of Charleston during the war, and things of that sort happened. And at the time, the whole world had been moving in a direction in terms of international law of agreeing that the intentional harm inflicted on civilians was a war crime. Everybody understood it's inevitable that civilians would be harmed in a war, but to intentionally aim at them and kill them on purpose, as Sherman did and some of his other compatriots, was a war crime. One of the biographers of Sherman that I cite in my writings said that had the South won, they would have been justified in stringing up, hanging Sherman and Lincoln and the entire Union Army High Command for committing war crimes. And this was a pro-Sherman biographer who said
Didn't General Sherman continue the slaughter of innocents by his attacks on and degradations of Native Americans? Wasn't he more or less charged by the Republicans in the Congress to do this in the years following the Civil War?
Yes, he was. Just 3 months after the war ended, Sherman was put in charge of the military district of the Missouri. The South was broken up into land west of the Mississippi, and his basic job is, I call it, committing a crusade of genocide against the Plains Indians to make way for the railroads. And in one of my publications in the Independent Review about 10 years ago, it's called Violence in the American West, Myth versus Reality, in the Independent Review. It's online. I quote Sherman as saying, we're not going to let a few thieving Indians stand in the way of the railroads. And it was a 25-year war against Plains Indians, and they killed some 45,000 of them, according to the latest estimates that I've seen by historians. And that included women and children, indiscriminately shot, bombed, killed. They killed all the animals. They even waged war on the buffalo, which because the Indians relied on the buffalo for everything, food, clothing, even made fish hooks out of the buffalo bones. And so they thought that was sort of another way of committing genocide against Plains Indians. and Sherman, Sheridan, Grant, Custer, and all the rest were involved in this for the years after the war. And the disgusting thing to me about this judge is they recruited ex-slaves to participate in this. The Indians called them buffalo soldiers, and they've made movies about them and written books about them. But what they were engaged in is really something even worse than slavery. It was killing Indians. At least a slave can always hope to escape, but when you're dead, you're dead. And so that's, a fate even worse than slavery as far as I'm concerned.
Isn't this then followed by Teddy Roosevelt and the murder of Filipinos and the Spanish-American War? Again, all of this in the name of exceptionalism, the right of Americans to expand, control, take property, tell how people to live, how people should live, slaughter anybody that looks different and gets in the way.
Yeah, that's the point I make in this article, that the state can't come out and say we are going to invade the Philippines because for economic reasons. They always have to have some phony humanitarian reason. We want to civilize them. We want to Christianize them, something like that. But in the case of the Philippine insurrection in the 1880s, the Filipinos had just gotten rid of the Spanish Empire, and so the Americans come in and say, "Hold on there, you're going to now become a part of our empire."
Right.
And the Filipinos did not want that, and so they had a relatively short war, a couple of years, not that short. And at least from all the historians I've read on this, the number of deaths seems to be around 200,000 Filipinos killed by the U.S. government. But I found one book, though, one historian said it may be as many as 1 million to put that down. And that came after the war on the Indians, on the Plains Indians.
I neglected to ask you about one of Lincoln's greatest failures, maybe the greatest, which is the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which allowed, of course, soldiers in the North to arrest anybody they wanted, and that person was not permitted to be brought before a judge. No charges were preferred against the person. They were just locked up.
Yes. Yes, that was one of Lincoln's famous tyrannical acts. The Constitution does give Congress the right to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, but not while the civil courts are still operating, which they were in the North.
Correct.
But Lincoln arbitrarily did it himself, and then Congress, the Republican Congress, later ratified it themselves. And they mass arrested tens of thousands of Northerners for simply being suspected of speaking up against the Lincoln administration. They even, in my book, Lincoln Unmasked, I present evidence that they even sent soldiers to the homes of judges because they thought that a federal judge was going to issue a writ of habeas corpus to someone who had been accused of, quote, treason, meaning criticizing Lincoln, he wouldn't be able to get to court. His home was surrounded by soldiers.
Wow.
That happened on several occasions. And so, and that's even worse. And of course, after the war was over, the Supreme Court finally admitted that this was unconstitutional. The civil courts were operating, and that was that.
I remember having. It's funny how this stuff is relevant even in the modern era. I remember having a debate, more or less, on Fox in my days at Fox with Senator Lindsey Graham. Now you can imagine which way this is going to go because I told you who it is, arguing that habeas corpus should be suspended in the days and weeks following 9/11, certainly in New York. And I said, well, Senator Graham, only Congress can do it, not the president. Well, I'm going to introduce legislation. All right, well, Congress can only do it when in the case of insurrection and rebellion, so that the courts can't meet. Well, the courts can't meet. I said, Senator Graham, the federal courts are about 5 blocks from where the World Trade Towers sat. They were in session 2 days later. You still want to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in New York, and allow the police and soldiers to arrest anybody they want. I mean, the point is he was making the same argument that Lincoln did. Unfortunately, Lincoln's suspension was not reversed until the case reached the Supreme Court. Lincoln was dead. The war was over. So at least the right of habeas corpus existed during the tragedy of Reconstruction, but it certainly didn't exist in the North during the war. Can you argue, Tom DiLorenzo, that this whole attitude of American exceptionalism provoked World War I, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and to this day, Ukraine?
I think so. I think it's the sort of the ideological cornerstone of foreign policy interventionism, and has been for a very long time. And all of this started almost immediately after the war. The 3 months after the war was over was when the war against the Plains Indians commenced. They took over Hawaii. The American soldiers literally held the king of Hawaii at gunpoint and forced him to sign a new constitution that disenfranchised his own people, Native Hawaiians, and so they could take over the pineapple fields in Hawaii, and the Philippine insurrection. The Spanish-American War was unjustifiable, but they justified it anyway by this treasury of virtue that they were said to possess. And that's why to this day, not too long ago during the second Bush administration, Bush Jr., Newt Gingrich wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal arguing the invasion of Iraq, Libya, Saudi Arabia, I think one or two other Middle Eastern countries, and the title of the article was "Lincoln and Bush." He wanted to make the argument that Lincoln would do this, therefore it must be unquestioned to do this. And so even foreign tyrants, Musharraf, the former dictator of Pakistan, when he imposed martial law in his country, he quoted Abraham Lincoln as saying, "Well, Lincoln did it, so it must be acceptable thing to do." And so even foreign tyrants have tried to latch on to this whole idea of American exceptionalism.
We just put a comment up on the screen from one of our writers, and it seems to be the theme of the people that are the good folks watching us now that are commenting, is that they never learned any of this in school. The public schools, I think, are largely responsible. Forgive me. The government schools are largely responsible for the promulgation of the deification of Lincoln. You just don't hear these arguments in government schools. I didn't even hear these arguments in my undergraduate years. I began to make them in law school, reading about the suspension of habeas corpus, and people looked at me like I had two heads. Before I let you go, the Mises Institute, tell us a little bit about it and what plans you have. You and I know well your predecessor, Jeff Deist, who did a spectacular job there. He's moved on, and now you're going to be running the show.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I've been associated with the Mises Institute for at least 35 years, and I consider it to be the preeminent organization in the world in teaching and about free market economics and libertarianism, as far as that's concerned. And the sort of the dual philosophy is the libertarianism of Murray Rothbard, along with the economics of the Austrian School of Economics, Ludwig von Mises. More people are familiar with Friedrich Hayek, but it's the Mises Institute. And I'm excited about doing some great things with scholarship and education. And the purpose is not necessarily to comment on the latest bill before Congress, but to educate the public in economics, free market economics. And I consider it to be sort of an ammunition factory in the war of ideas. And we've been very successful so far. And I want to bring it over the top and make it, the most successful ever in reaching a lot of people and educating people about why freedom is better than tyranny, capitalism is better than socialist hell, and all the other things we've been talking about.
And peace is better than war. You have a lot of fans here, not just in me. Well, that's unfair because you and I have been friends for so long. but also in the people that watch this show. And by the way, if you need somebody to teach natural rights and constitutional principles, just pick up the phone. I'll be there.
Okay.
Tom DiLorenzo, always a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you for joining us. This is a refreshing break from our usual platter of what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in Ukraine. But we now know how people can argue that what's going on in Gaza sometimes is okay because Lincoln did it, and how what's happening in Ukraine is okay because somehow we have to spread American exceptionalism. You have debunked those myths, Tom DiLorenzo. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Judge. Have a great day.
Yes, of course, a pleasure. All right, my friends, back to our regular fare. Tomorrow, Professor Jeffrey Sachs at noon Eastern. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.